If you started playing Rune Dice thinking it was just another simple dice roguelike, think again. This game hides a considerable depth in its combinations, decisions, and especially in how you build each run. And that is exactly where I got stuck. Because it is not just about getting lucky with the dice, it is about knowing how to manipulate the game in your favor, understanding the underlying systems, and turning average runs into overpowered builds. So today I will show you 10 advanced tips that completely change the way I play Rune Dice. Things the mechanics do not explain well, but that make all the difference when you actually start mastering it. I am Matthew, and the video is about to begin. If there is one thing that took me a while to accept in Rune Dice, it is that more options do not always mean more power. Actually, it is the opposite. The famous deck thinning syndrome hits hard here because the game constantly tempts you to pick up new dice, test combinations, experiment, but that starts to completely mess up your consistency without you noticing. The problem is physical and strategic at the same time. The more different dice you have, the lower the chance of them meeting on the board to merge. And in Rune Dice, that is everything. There is no point in having a bunch of cool effects if the dice do not interact with each other in practice. You end up with a cluttered board full of loose pieces that do not evolve, and your turns start to stall. This is where the ancient altars come in, and a lot of people underestimate how strong they are. A beginner usually uses the altar with fear, as if it were too rare a resource to risk. An advanced player does the opposite. They use it aggressively to clear the deck. Purging a basic die, risking an upgrade, refining the build, all of this makes your setup much leaner and more functional. And when you get this right, the gameplay changes entirely. Merges start happening in sequence, combos flow, and you feel like you finally have control of the run. Fewer dice, more impact. It is counterintuitive at first, but after you play a few runs focusing on this, it becomes impossible to go back to the take everything that appears playstyle. If you are playing Rogue in Rune Dice and have not yet noticed the potential of poison, you are leaving a lot of damage on the table. This class is not about hitting hard all at once. It is about accelerating the match to the point where every action you take turns into an avalanche. And here comes the trick that completely changes the run. Exponential scaling with weakness. The secret lies in the relics that apply weakness whenever you merge dice. It seems like a simple effect at first glance, but in practice, it sets the stage for something much bigger. Poison in this game does not scale linearly. It responds to the target's modifiers. In other words, the more debuffs you stack beforehand, the higher the final result. And this is where the mechanics click. When you apply weakness before triggering a poison die, the final damage simply spikes. It is not a small increase. It is the kind of multiplication that makes you look at the numbers and rethink the math. The system rewards those who understand the order of actions, and this combination turns the rogue into a damage scaling machine. In practice, when this synergy hits, the run becomes much more stable. You stop relying on luck and start building a consistent damage engine over time. It is the type of build that grows quietly, and before you know it, is melting enemies that previously seemed impossible. If you enjoy smart setups and progression that scales gradually, this is one of the most efficient ways to play the rogue. In the beginning, it is very natural to spread your attacks across the map, trying to cover everything and hit as many enemies as possible. However, the mage does not reward this chaotic style. This class is much more about area control than raw range. When you start focusing your attacks on a single quadrant, the dynamic changes. Elemental puddles and storms start to overlap, and what was once just okay damage turns into a continuous damage zone. Enemies caught in there simply melt, because the dot damage over time stacks in layers. It is not immediate burst damage, but rather a constant pressure that scales very fast. And here is where the most interesting strategic part comes in. You need to force the enemy to stay in that space. This means thinking about the positioning of your dice, the timing of your rolls, and even how you manipulate the flow of enemies across the map. It is not just rolling dice. It is building a trap. When it works, you control the entire battlefield. Interestingly, the more enemies group together, the better this strategy becomes. Unlike other builds that struggle against large groups, the mage benefits from them. You turn that chaos of multiple enemies into fuel for your own damage, resulting in a domino effect of eliminations that happens almost automatically. One thing that took me a while to accept is that health is not exactly a resource to protect. It is a resource to spend. When you start seeing HP as currency, the approach changes entirely, especially when playing more aggressive runs. Those moments at the shop or altar stop being difficult decisions and become clear opportunities to get much stronger. Permanent passive relics are, in most cases, much more valuable than keeping your health full at the beginning of the map. And the mechanics basically encourage this all the time. Paying half your health sounds scary the first time, but once you understand how much these relics impact the rest of the run, it is hard to justify not taking them. The key point here is that you get plenty of tools to recover health later. Support dice merges end up becoming a consistent source of sustain during normal combat, so that initial loss dilutes very quickly. You sacrifice now to stabilize later, but with much more accumulated power. When this mindset clicks, your runs start to snowball. You invest heavily early on, grab relics that actually matter, and spend the rest of the map playing with an advantage. It is the classic high roll strategy. You take a calculated risk early, and in return, get a run that scales much harder than normal. This is one of those decisions that separates an okay run from a run that truly scales in Rune dice. On the procedural map, it is very easy to fall into the temptation of choosing the safest path, avoiding elite battles early on to prepare better. But in practice, this usually delays your power spike too much. When you face elites right in the first act, you are basically betting on the snowball effect. The relics that come from these fights are far more impactful than any common reward, and getting one or two strong synergies early completely changes the pace of the run. Suddenly, encounters that would be difficult become manageable, and your build starts to have a clear identity much faster. Of course, there's a risk, a significant one. If your setup has not clicked yet, an elite can end the run right there, but that is exactly where game sense comes in. Knowing when you have the minimum tools to face these fights, even if it is not perfect, is an essential skill. An advanced player does not wait for the ideal build. They force the build to happen through these decisions, and the impact of this shows up later. When you reach the third act bosses with strong relics accumulated early on, the difference is massive. While more conservative runs start to struggle with the difficulty spike, yours is already running smoothly with established synergies and room for error. It is the kind of choice that seems risky at first, but pays huge dividends in the end. There is a mechanic that, once you get the hang of it, makes it feel like you are breaking the game. The ricochet before the merge. At first, it is easy to just focus on matching identical dice directly, but when you start thinking about the path the die takes before that, your options expand completely. The idea here is simple, but highly effective. You throw the die so that it first hits a different value and only then finds its pair to merge. This slight detour triggers an extra chain reaction, and that totally changes the impact of that turn. Instead of a single reaction, you are basically doubling the effect with a single move. In practice, this becomes a great tool for clearing waves. You know those turns when the board is starting to get out of control? A well-planned ricochet can reset everything. And the most interesting part is that this does not depend on a specific build. It is pure execution. It is about understanding positioning and exploiting the physics to its maximum. Once you internalize this, it is hard to go back to playing normally. You start seeing angles, trajectories, and opportunities all the time. And when you land 2 triggers in a single move, it is a defining moment for the run. It seems small, but it is exactly this kind of detail that separates an average run from a dominant one. If there is one thing that defines the pace of a run, it is how you play the early game. And here is a truth that might seem a bit counterintuitive. Trying to play too safely at the beginning usually leaves you weaker later on. Economy rules everything here. Whenever coin dice, chess dice, or upgrade dice appear, the priority should be clear. Merge them without a second thought, even if it costs a bit of health. These dice are basically a direct investment in the future of your run. More gold, more items, more upgrades. All of this accumulates fast and creates an advantage that you cannot recover later by playing strictly safe. And there is an important detail that many players ignore. Sometimes it is even worth holding out for one more turn just to generate more of these dice on the screen. It sounds risky because you are leaving enemies alive for longer, but the return pays off. It is the kind of decision that requires a bit of nerve, but when it works, you feel the run becoming richer and more stable at the same time. When you truly start prioritizing the economy, the pace of the match shifts. Instead of surviving turn by turn, you start building an advantage. And Rune Dice heavily rewards those who understand this early, because the sooner you scale your resources, the more freedom you have to put together strong builds and handle any situation later. This tip seems counterintuitive at first, but once you understand the rhythm of Rune Dice, it becomes almost an unwritten rule. An easy path usually means a weak run. Avoiding difficult nodes might keep you alive longer in the short term, but you pay for it later when your build simply cannot keep up with the game's difficulty. The tough encounters are where the game truly rewards you. More coins, more chances for special dice to appear on the field, and rewards that actually impact your build. It is in these moments that you find game-changing pieces, not just minor upgrades. If you only play it safe, your progression remains lukewarm, without that necessary power leap. There's also an important factor that many ignore. Playing under pressure improves your decision-making. Hard encounters force you to use your resources better, think about positioning, and extract value from every move. You naturally start playing more efficiently because the game leaves no room for silly mistakes. And of course, it is not about being reckless. It is about understanding that risk is part of the run's growth. When you start prioritizing these heavier paths, your runs scale much faster. And then what seemed difficult at the beginning becomes the exact reason you reach the end strong. This one is tough to swallow at first because it goes against that basic instinct to survive at any cost. In Rune Dice, you go into your first runs wanting to preserve HP as if it were the most important resource. But over time, you realize that in the early floors, health is basically a currency you invest to get stronger. If you start playing defensively too early, avoiding damage at all costs, you lose opportunities to grab better relics, optimize your economy, and build a solid foundation for your setup. Meanwhile, more aggressive runs are already accumulating power. And then comes a point where it does not matter if you have full HP. Your build simply cannot keep up. Focusing on offense early on speeds everything up. You clear fights faster, reduce the duration of encounters, which ironically also reduces the total damage you take, and start creating synergies sooner. It is the classic rule: the best defense here really is to eliminate the threat before the problem grows. Now, this does not mean completely ignoring your health. There is a clear limit. When you start approaching around 20 HP without a consistent source of healing, then it is time to adjust the pace and play more cautiously. But up to that point, treating HP as a resource to be spent and not protected at all costs is what really gets your runs going. A classic trap is treating runes as if they were extremely rare items that you need to save for the perfect moment, and that moment never comes. In practice, the longer you hold on to them, the more value you lose. Runes were made to be used, not hoarded. Especially against bosses, there is no reason to save them. That is where every little advantage truly makes a difference, and a well-used rune can completely turn the tide of the fight. Instead of going in trying to see what happens, go in already planning to spend resources to guarantee consistency. The treasure rune, for example, shines a lot in jester nodes. It is the kind of combination that seems simple but delivers a massive return if you use it with the right timing. The shuffle rune, on the other hand, is almost a precision tool. It solves those gridlocked boards where you know there is a strong merge available, but you just cannot access it. When you start using runes actively, the gameplay becomes more fluid and much more under your control. You stop relying so much on the luck of the next turn and start creating your own opportunities. And honestly, that is when Rune Dice starts showing how strategic it really is.
They disappear. I am blinded by the dark. And all